I hope we can start. We are already a bit delayed. So welcome to the module on commons and municipalism. Danijela here and me will be conveners of the module. So for the next 3 days, if you have any questions about the module or any suggestions for improvements, etc., just come to us. As Danijela explained, we already in the plenary, it is going to be consisting of 4 lectures with a Q&A session for questions and answers after these lectures, each one of 90 minutes. And then at the end, the final day, there will be a workshop on municipalism in practice and commons in practice, especially with experience from Ne davimo Beograd and Zagreb and Naš. So this will be more kind of interactive and participatory workshop with some tasks where all participants will do and try to implement some of the mostly theory which you will be getting through the module in the first 2 days. After this lecture, there will be a short break of 10 minutes before the next lecture of Debbie Bukchin. And then after that, we will split for lunch around 2:15. So we hope that this is okay by you. So my job on this first lecture will be to do a very kind of introduction to theory of the commons. And we have to apologize here for all of those who are not for the first time in Green Academy and many times heard about the commons, heard maybe even our lectures. Because for some of you, this will be very kind of maybe basic and known. But Green Academy, as you know, is a school. There's an education program going on. And for all the participants who applied, who came here for the first time, the role of this lecture is to do some basic introduction to the theory of the commons. And also we will try to put some kind of perspective of Southeastern Europe to this theory and practice of the commons. And this is, you can find much more about it because this will be a very brief lecture in the book which Institute for Political Ecology published recently. There's a much bigger theoretical overview, and also there are cases of governance, commons governance in Southeast Europe, mostly not in this part we did only Croatia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also cases of struggles around commons. So you can find a lot of information about this in the book. And we brought some of these books so you can take them. And also the book is available online, so you can download it at any point from the website of Institute for Political Ecology. Also the presentation, you don't have to write. You will get the presentations in the end, so just focus on the lecture. And feel free to ask any questions during the lecture if you need some clarification or whatsoever. Okay? So the structure of this lecture will be in 4 elements. The first is the introduction to the classical commons theory, which is mostly related to the work of Elinor Ostrom. And then some introduction to the critical theory of the commons, mostly based on Silke Helfrich, Silvio Federici, and David Harvey, and Ugo Mattei. And then some regional context of the commons in Southeast Europe, also very short one. And then maybe something of the cases that we researched related to commons governance and commons struggles in Southeast Europe, and some of the preliminary findings we established from this research. So first of all, I mean, for maybe those of you who are here for the first time, why to talk even about the commons? And often I use this is the year when pretty much I started to work on commons, 2009. And this is the year when different data show that research on commons multiplied after this 2009. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, the economic crisis which followed after the crash of financial markets in the end of 2008, which was the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. And we can still feel the consequence of this crisis after the crash of unregulated financial markets. And then also in the same year, we had, the end of this year, we had the kind of continuation of the climate crisis, because in the end of this year in Copenhagen, there was a climate summit where all the world governments met to regulate or to solve the problems of climate change and to regulate the use of the atmosphere as one of the biggest common resources. And they failed miserably. And we can see still, we can also now say that they still failed. There was some maybe progress in 2015 in the Paris summit, but obviously not enough. And we can see that things are not going well in terms of that. So I'm saying this because often commons are somehow put comparing or against on versus states and markets as some kind of different governance regime comparing to the states and markets. So we saw in 2009 how the markets failed. We saw in 2009 how the governments failed on global level. And then in this same year, Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences went to Elinor Ostrom after decades of her research on the commons, which some authors, we including, see as another kind of governance regime. And this was maybe, this was because of this crisis and failure of markets and governments, this was seen, there was a search for new paradigm or for new kind of social movement which would connect different struggles, and maybe even for new property regime for some authors, and also for a new governance regime comparing to the markets and states governance regimes. But this, I mean, to say that this is a new paradigm and the new movement is also to some extent true. I mean, this was popularized pretty much after the Elinor Ostrom received Nobel Prize in Economics, and she was the first and still the only woman who got this award, which we always say, you know, speaks a lot about the economic sciences today. But actually the common institution, the common resources, the common governance, the common use was something which was going on for hundreds of thousands of years actually. So we saw practices around the world, and this we can see from anthropological research and evidence, that there are practices around the world in different cultures of using resources in common. Throughout prehistory, before even the states and civilizations and the states and even property was invented. So we had this kind of commoning of resources much before, for hundreds of thousands of years in these prehistoric communities, before the first states appeared. And also what many authors believe is that in the same time when states appeared, also the property rights, the property regimes, the private property also appeared in the same time, parallel to the states, and not as some liberal and especially libertarian authors say that the property was preceding the states. That okay, I don't want to go into details of the theory of the state, but basically that the property was before the states, and then the free people decided to establish the state in order to protect their life, freedom, and property. The anthropological evidence actually shows that the states created property, that property was going in parallel with the development of the state and not preceding the beginning of the first states somewhere around 10,000 years ago. Also, you had different concepts which were related to commons in the ancient civilizations like the Roman Empire and Roman Republic. You had the concept of res communis, which was basically the concept saying that some resources should be accessible to all, and they are accessible to all. And they cannot be part of property regime in any kind of private manner, in terms of that no access can be denied to anybody except on the criteria of sustainability of the use of that resource. So let's say to simplify, that would be something which would be everybody's property. So everybody, all the members of society or all the people could access these resources. This is quite different, and there's often confusion from nobody's property, which is a concept which in Roman law is called res nullius, which is still nobody's property. Maybe this would be a better translation, because for some resources like animals in the forest, it was nobody's property until somebody captured them or hunted them down, and then it could become a private property. Then it could become a part of the property regime and property rights. Also, I mean, the origin of the commons and even the word commons goes back to the common land in the Middle Ages, the Europe of Middle Ages, connected with the feudalism system, and these words, which actually commons comes not only from Latin but from Old French. It was related to the special kind of Norman feudal system which was implemented in England after the 11th century, where a part of the land called banal was a kind of property or controlled by the feudal lords, and part of the land was actually used and accessed by the farmers, be it free farmers or serfs, and it was called commune. Also, as you know, the enclosure of the commons as a process, historical process, which started in the 13th century, increased in 16th, and especially in the 18th century with the help of the state, was also something which was described by Karl Marx as a precondition for capitalism, where a large parts of the land were enclosed, so access to this land was not anymore available to farmers for their subsistence, for their daily subsistence and production. And this created preconditions for the first capital accumulation, and also made a lot of people landless, which created preconditions for them to become working class, a labor force for new manufacturing and then later industries. So this is also where commons are often found in the literature before. In terms of there's also sometimes some authors see commons not as a new governance regime, but actually as a new property regime, and this is also something which is debated heavily. But also, I mean, this is maybe some kind of basic typology of property by Waldron, where the property is divided in three categories: the private property, the collective property, and common property, where the private property will be when the authority to govern resources is assigned to some individual, company, or a family. Collective property, where society as a whole, be it on the state level or on some kind of local community level, formally decides how to use important resources, and these resources are then governed by the states or formal local communities. And then common property, which are resources which are available for use to all by Waldron, where a set of rules, as I said, can exist only to restrict access, which would make the access to these resources unsustainable or impossible in the future. So there are some kind of Roman law equivalents which could be assigned to these property types as res privata, res publica, and res communis. In terms of the commons theory, which started to develop after the Second World War, mostly in classical legal theory, in classical political science, and especially classical economic science, there are different perspectives, and here I'll talk briefly about the classical theory of the commons, which is most related to Ostrom, and then later about the critical theory of the commons. So in terms of classical theory of the commons, it's pretty much connected to the classical, or we could say neoclassical, theory of the goods from the economic sciences. And some of these authors are well known to you, which studied economics, where there was some kind of division of the goods, apparently according to their inherent characteristics, where some goods are free, and therefore they are not economic because they are free, accessible to all. They are not supposed to be produced. And some goods which are supposed to be produced are economic because there's some kind of economic activity needed for them. And then the division on private and collective consumption goods, which was done by Samuelson. Then the introduction of something which are called club goods and also toll goods by Buchanan. And then something which is called common pool resources by Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom in 1977. So let's try just briefly to show what is this kind of typology of the goods. So the private goods, so they are kind of divided into four categories according to two criteria. The first criteria is excludability of the goods, and the second criteria on the left is the rivalry of the goods, where excludability would mean if these goods inherently by their characteristics are impossible or difficult to exclude access to someone. While the rivalry criteria would be if the consumption or use of these goods is basically decreasing the value or possibility to use this good by other people in the present or in the future. So according to these two criteria, these goods are then divided into these four categories. The private goods, with example of sandwich, which is both excludable and rivalrous, so it's easy to exclude somebody to eat your sandwich. And also if you eat your sandwich, others cannot eat that same sandwich. So the consumption of that good is rivalrous. The same goes for t-shirt, mobile phone, etc. And then if you look at different rivalrous but non-excludable resources, these are common goods or common pool resources, as the Ostroms call them. Apparently, which are non-excludable, which means that they are difficult to exclude access to their use, but they are definitely rivalrous. And if some people use it, that decreases the possibility of other people to use the same goods. Like the atmosphere, for example, because, for example, we know that it's difficult to prevent access or to regulate access to use the atmosphere as a carbon sink, where we emit with our daily activities different climate emissions, which causes the climate change. And yet we also know that these climate emissions, like carbon emissions, are stored in the atmosphere. So this is a carbon sink that if I'm using, somebody else cannot use it because it's limited, because it creates climate change and problems for the whole world in different manner, etc. Then the club goods, which are non-rivalrous, but they are excludable. They are easy to exclude, like for example, the highway, where it's easy to exclude somebody to use the highway because you put you put on entrance to highway some kind of charge, some access to you regulate the access to this consumption of this good, but yet they are non-rivalrous because if you are using the highway, that doesn't prevent some other people to use the highway at the same time. This, of course, can create congestion problems. So at some point, if too many people use the highways, then the use or the value of this good decreases. But this is not to be confused with rivalry. And then, of course, the public goods, which are both non-excludable and non-rivalrous, like the parks, the street lighting, the radio. So I'm showing this is the neoclassical typology of the goods. This is how the classical theory of commons started. And there are many problems with this kind of typology. And this was heavily criticized by critical scholars of the commons. First of all of these kind of goods it's really depends on the context, if they are actually excludable, if they are rivalrous or not. So, and this is in this kind of bold letters, you can see the example of water, which depending on the context can be put in different of these goods. So the bottled water can be very excludable and very rivalrous. And in the same time, the water stream, non-excludable, maybe as a common pool resource, the freshwater lake, if you talk about the water for drinking, so only the use of this water is for drinking, would be with characteristic a public good, and then water distribution system with pipes in your cities as something which you can charge the access to the water distribution, but if I use the water, that doesn't prevent you to use the water in the same time. So it depends on the context. This is the first criticism. The second criticism is that these are not inherent, that the characteristics of these goods change. And they change depending on the social relations, the political context, etc. So something which is now excludable can be non-excludable, or something which is now rivalrous, also depending on technological changes, can become non-rivalrous in the future. So this is very kind of problematic typology, but this is how the economists see commons or common pool resources by defining it and putting in this fourth category. When talking about the classical theory of the commons, many of you probably know about the article, the essay in Science Journal of Nature called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin. And he was talking pretty much about common pool resources, saying that, taking an example of pasture, that if people are maximizing their individual interest, if they are becoming so-called rationally, that will lead to collective outcome which will be irrational. Meaning that if, taking an example of pasture, if people want to increase their utility, if they want to increase their consumption and use, they will add more cows to the pasture, and this will then create the problem of overgrazing, and basically at the end everybody will suffer. So if some people are doing it, they are doing it because they're expecting the others to do it, and then everybody's doing it, and then it comes, the ecosystem, the resource comes to collapse, and then everybody's suffering. So they're supposed to be rational behavior leads to collective rational outcome. And he said that the only way to solve this problem of tragedy of the commons, which he said is happening all the time in past and will happen in future, is through two different choices. Either through central regulation by the state, where all of these common pool resources are regulated how they are used by the governments, by the states, or through allocation of private property rights. So then this pasture is divided for users, and everybody has a part of the pasture as their private property. So that this, in his mind, are the only ways how this tragedy of the commons can be solved. First of all, I mean, there are many also critiques coming from the critical scholars on this very kind of simple thought experiment and model. First of all, actually the experience and empirical evidence shows that most of these, actually even pastures that he's talking about, were never open access. So it was never the situation that anybody could access the pasture and put as many cows as they wanted, because for many centuries these pastures were governed by communities, and they were governed sustainably, and they were never open access. There was always restricted access, and defined who will have access to the pasture by some kind of community which surrounded or which were nearby to the pasture, etc. So this situation where this is an open access resource is actually refuted by the empirical evidence, where this was not so in different cultures through centuries. The second situation is that his model is based on presumption that the people will not communicate themselves and actually see the problem that they are having. And if they are supposed to be rational, then they will be rational also about the outcome of this kind of maximizing gain from this pasture. And then they will probably devise some kind of rules, some kind of institutions on how to avoid this collapse, which is not in nobody's interest. So his model is based on presumption where everybody behaves rationally, meaning selfishly, and then then there's a collapse of the common pool resource. The third critique comes where he says, okay, this is the problem, but actually some critical scholars say, no, the problem is not the common pool resource. The problem is the private property of the cattle, of the cows, because if there was a common property of the cattle, then there would be no kind of incentive to use that pasture individually to maximize the benefit. So that's the problem, and not the problem of the common pasture. So, okay, I mean, there are many other also critiques, but let's say these are the most important ones. And the biggest kind of critique in the academic circles came from Eleanor Ostrom, who she actually heard his lecture on some of, when she was a student, and then she couldn't believe what she's hearing, because she was already researching as a student, I think as a PhD student, many cases where this didn't happen. And then she was like, okay, I mean, but what this guy is saying is just not true in reality. I mean, empirical evidence shows differently. And then she started to study this kind of, these common pool resources around the world in different cultures. And she basically saw that in many cases, these resources were mostly natural common pool resources, but she also had some of the human-built resources like irrigation systems, but they are again related to the water, so it was most related to natural common pool resources. She figured out that this is actually that for many centuries, communities around the world managed to self-regulate and to use sustainably these common pool resources without any kind of government regulation or any kind of state intervention, and without privatizing these resources and allocating the private property rights. Also, I mean, for her, and this is also maybe one of her problems, she comes from, she's very much linked to this intellectual tradition of economists that I just said about this, who talked about these goods, like Samuelson, like Buchanan, etc. And she saw also commons not really as a social practice, but as resource. She also believed that common pool resources have some inherent characteristics, and therefore commons are some inherent resources that should be governed. So it's kind of very basic definition of commons that she uses as simply a resource which is shared by a group of people. And this is something which is criticized by the critical scholars, and they take commons more as a social practice, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. She also, because she also believed that these common pool resources should be governed, and they should be governed sustainably so they don't collapse. She looked and she researched different experiences around the world, and then she was looking at different institutions, different rules for governing these resources. And she tried to extrapolate what is common for those practices which survived. What is common for those rules and institutions which managed for centuries to sustainably use these resources. And then she developed 8 principles which should be respected if somebody is designing rules and institutions for governing these kind of resources. Because she established that when these principles are met, then this practice will go on. It will, you know, there'll be people who are using the resource, and the resource will not collapse, and you know, it will be sustainable. Also, she was always stressing that common pool resources are different from something which is called common property regimes. So she also spoke about situation where property rights of access, of use, and control over the resource are actually the authority to have these rights is given to community or to some collective, to some kind of a collective of people. But she said that common pool resources can be owned by communities, they can be owned by governments, by states, they can be owned by private companies, and common pool resources, it doesn't have to be that they will be owned by some kind of common property regime. This is also something which is debated by the critical scholars. So the critical scholars, so first of all, as you know, I mean, just basically critical theory, critical social theory doesn't study just the world as it is, but tries to see how the society can be transformed to the ways without oppression, without exploitation, to the ways of emancipation, etc. So they were looking at how the commons actually, what are these desirable commons, and how could commons be used for some kind of social transformation, for some kind of progressive social transformation. So they were criticizing mostly Ostrom on her intellectual tradition, which I said comes pretty much from neoclassical economics. And she was even a chair of Public Choice Society, together with Buchanan and some kind of intellectual fathers of something which we call today neoliberalism. She was even a chair of this society where most neoliberals were members. But, and this also influenced her ontological base, where she kind of looked at the agency of individuals on micro level, looking at different communities, but you know, not having in mind that these communities are embedded in wider macro-structural situations, economic and political, and they're influenced by these macroeconomic and macro-political structures. That these are not isolated in space, but they are influenced by kind of, you know, structural drivers. But she looked at these communities as isolated, and she looked at individuals. She even says that her definition of community is a group of individuals. So she's always kind of individualist in her also methodological kind of point of view. And this, of course, makes her theory limited for something which we would use for some kind of progressive social changes. And she also didn't look at power relations within these communities, which also affect the way how resources are used, how they are accessed, and how they are controlled. Also, I mean, critical scholars mostly see commons as a social practice. They don't see commons as a resource or as a good. They see it as a social practice, mostly mostly consisting from different elements, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And they also see that commons are not something which is objective, something which is simply there, but something which is contested, something which is embedded in different social struggles, different power relations, something which is inherently political, something which is contested, something which is not static, but something which is dynamic, because the social relations are dynamic, the power relations are dynamic. And something which is based on this kind of context, so there's nothing inherent about commons. It depends on the context and how do we interpret it, each single social practice. And also some of the scholars see, and me including, commons as a different governance regime, comparing to the markets and states. But some scholars also see commons as a different property regime, comparing to the private property on one hand and public property on the other. Bearing in mind that public property in our kind of modern capitalist societies, that even public property is seen as private property. So when state owns a company, state is supposed to behave towards this company as the state would to any kind of other private owner. So that's even in most of our constitutions, that if state owns something, the state is supposed, like any kind of company, this company cannot be put in any kind of favorable position towards the private company. So even that state property behaves as a private property, where state is a private owner of something. And then, of course, there's some kind of goods, some kind of resources, which are more like res communis. For example, we are here in the sea. So in Croatia, maybe this would be some kind of pomorsko dobro. Kind of sea good, some kind of strip of land just next to the sea, which is supposed to be accessible to everybody, something which cannot be or shouldn't be treated as any kind of property, should not be exchanged on the market, etc. So there are some kind of resources like this, usually called opće dobro or common good, would maybe, or general good would be maybe the translation in the English. But most of the goods are, most of the resources are privately owned, or they are state-owned, but then still basically privately owned. And as I said, commons is then seen as a social relation, and that would mean, and this is maybe this is the theory which most of the critical scholars take, that when you look at different definitions of commons in critical sense, they all usually, all of these definitions, from Federici to Harvey to etc., but even to Ostrom, have basically three elements which together define something which we would call commons. So commons is not a resource. A resource is only one element out of three which define commons. So the elements of commons in this kind of relational theory, and these three elements are in a mutual relationship, are resource, community, and institutions. So the resource, which can be either natural or kind of cultural resource or human, so natural or human built. It can be tangible or intangible, so tangible like water, or intangible as information, as knowledge, as language, etc., etc. So there are different types of resources which can be kind of practiced through the commons, which could be governed through the commons. And usually this part of the resource in this kind of terminology is called common good then. The second element is the community. So the resource is the object of the governance of the commons. The subject of the governance of the commons, those who are governing, is called community. And this is the group of people who have kind of authority and control and access to the use of certain resource. This community is something which is very controversial element of the commons, and there are many debates what constitutes community, who should be included in community over some kind of commons, who should have access, what kind of access it should be. Should it be free access? Should it be open access? Should it be fair access? Should it be limited access? How do we define what is fair access? For example, I'll give you one example. Many people believe, and we including, that water is a human right, and this was actually true in 2010. United Nations in 2010 made water as a human right. So we had to wait for more than 50 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the water becomes a human right. So we had a Universal Declaration of Human Rights made by UN without water, I mean, Pablo knows much more about it, without water being mentioned as a human right. It took us more than 50 years where water and sanitation became a human right, and this is still a struggle. There's still a struggle. There was a European Citizens Initiative to recognize water by the European Union institutions as a human right, to exclude it from the market exchange as a kind of human right. But then we come to the question, what should be then the access to the water? Should it be open access, or should it be, closed access? And here, different kind of perspectives come in place. If we take the water as an open access, we might come to the problem of everybody using as much water as they want, and water being a limited resource, that maybe we'd end up without water. And then, if it's not open, then who should have water? How much water? So if it's fair access to the water, how do we define what is fair? This is a part of political debate, and it's based on context, and it's different for every resource. It's different for every community, because it's different, there's a different context. So in some communities which have more water, and some communities which have less water, this would be very different outcome. And then the third element are the institutions, which are basically pretty much rules, pretty much patterns of behavior, some kind of consistent patterns which are used for governance of a commons. So basically, if the resource is the object and community is the subject of the commons, then the institutions present the regime of the commons governance. So the resources we usually call then the common goods, the community we call the commoners, and the institutions we call the commoning, the process of the commoning, the action of the commoning. And sometimes also, I mean, this is, very simplified version, but it's not very, it's not very simple in reality. And sometimes there are differences between the users and the commoners. For example, if you take the example of Wikipedia as a digital commons, we have a lot of users of Wikipedia, and I'm sure all of you are using Wikipedia, but not all of you are actually governing Wikipedia. Not all of you are contributing with writing articles on Wikipedia, or not all of you are editing articles on Wikipedia, discussing articles, and then voting about the articles in Wikipedia. So community, in my mind, and commoners are those who are governing, those who are contributing, and this can be different from users who can then be also accessible, because Wikipedia is an example of open access commons. So this resource can be used by everyone without any kind of access rules, but not everyone is contributing and governing Wikipedia. So there can be difference between the users and the commoners. And also, I mean, then the next question is, okay, if these are the commons, and this is some definition of the commons, how do we know what commons are desirable and what are not? Because we can think of many practices which satisfy this definition and satisfy this criteria, but we would not call them progressive. We would not desire them towards some kind of progressive social change. And for that, the normative criteria or normative theory of the commons comes in place, where critical scholars are debating, okay, what are the criteria upon which we are supposed to value, we are supposed to judge these social practices in order for them to be called progressive commons. So it's not just enough that they are, there's a community, there's a resource, there are some institutions sort of governing this resource, and these institutions are developed by the community, but also there are certain criteria that these social practices satisfy. So one of these, these criteria were put forward by Silke Helfrich, and they are pretty much also related to the elements of the commons, but they are also related to something which we might say are basic and core green and left political values that we share. And that's why we need these values to be incorporated in this criteria when we judge the commons. So the first one is first normative criteria is sustainable use. So if we want to talk about progressive commons, then they should be used sustainably. And when we say sustainably, mostly we mean on ecological sustainability, but we can also talk about, the social reproduction. We can talk about even material sustainability. We can talk about intergenerational sustainability and solidarity, etc., etc. Then the second criteria is that there should be fair access to the resources. So sustainable use of resources, and pretty much linked with progressive value of ecological sustainability. The fair access as normal criteria, and as we said, it can depend, on different contexts what is fair access. And nobody can say universally what is fair access because it's a part of political debate that we will have. So it will be a kind of democratic decision what is fair access for different resources within different contexts. So sometimes it will be open access for knowledge, for information, for goods which are which are intangible and therefore probably non-rivalrous. But then sometimes it will be limited, but it should be fair access for resources like water, like land, etc. And this fair access is related to community because it defines who is a part of community, who has access, who has control. And also not only access and control, but who has access to resources, which is pretty much linked to the social justice perspective and political value of progressives, of green and left colors. And then the third criteria is that there should be collective control of these resources, not in title, not nominally, but in reality, that there should be a real collective control over the resource, of defining institutions, that there should be collective control of defining institutions on governing this resource. And this should be democratic. So the community, all of people who are part of community should be able to define in democratic way institutions and rules to govern this resource. And also to define who has access and who doesn't, on which criteria, etc. So which is then linked to, of course, to the progressive value of democracy. And there is also a fourth, which is cross-cutting kind of criteria, which goes through all of these criteria related to resource, related to community, and related to institutions, so related to social justice, democracy, and sustainability, which is a gender perspective. And in terms of gender equality, etc., in terms of democracy, in terms of representation, in terms of real control, in terms of social reproduction, in terms of reproductive labor, etc., etc. And for example, we can tell you also for looking at different examples of cases that we together did, the team which did this book. So it's so beside Vera and me, Alma from Bosnia, Alma Midžić from Bosnia, and Ivana Drakić, who is here on the academy, but not maybe here, from Macedonia, and Miodrag Dakić from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We actually saw in many of the cases of governance, commons governance, we saw that women are not just underrepresented in all decision-making structures, but sometimes they are completely absent. And this is especially the case in something which we might say are, some call it rural commons, even though we try to avoid this word, but let's say commons which are related to land, which are related to the water, and in some kind of rural, or let's say not in cities, in these kind of areas. So what we did before we went to research on the context of the commons theory and practice, how does it relate to Southeast Europe, is that we try to define commons that fit best to the Southeast Europe context, because as we said that it depends on the context. And we pretty much took the governance theory, which is on commons, which is mostly based on the work of Elinor Ostrom, and then also by some other critical scholars, which defines commons as a social practice of governing a resource, not by state or market, but by a community of users, that self-governs the resource through institution that this community creates. And the second theory we took for the cases of different struggles over commons, the struggles against, on one way, etatization and the state control over the resources for the benefit of few who capture the state, and on the other hand, for privatization of these resources, again, for the benefit of few. So there are different struggles in Southeast Europe of people who are fighting both against this kind of state enclosure of the resources and against the privatization. And we wanted to see, we wanted to use the activist theory of the commons, which is mostly based on the work of Ugo Matei, which defined commons not as a social practice of governing, but as a political act of claiming resources in common through some kind of conflict, because politics is also about conflicts against, on one way, commodification of resources, commercialization and privatization, and on the other hand, against the state enclosure, the state, taking resources which are supposed to be then governed for the benefit of all, but they are basically governed for the benefit of few, those few who already captured the state and use it for their private interests. So these two kind of definitions we used, and we researched governance cases in Croatia, Bosnia, and Macedonia. And we also researched struggles over commons in these three countries. So we, okay, I'll tell a little bit about this kind of findings later. So we thought, so in terms of the context of the commons in Southeast Europe, as with many commons languages, it's really difficult to translate. The commons is used in English language. But actually, in all the other languages that we come across, and this also goes for Balkan languages, they're usually translated as common goods. Like bien commun in French, or beni comuni in Italian, or in Russian, or in our languages also zajednička dobra, which then creates this confusion that commons are resources, that commons are goods, because you translate it also as common goods, because in just translating commons literally in our language would not mean anything. So it's really difficult to translate and then to use this concept in some kind of political language. But also we thought that the concept of commons, to kind of link it to the tradition of commons and intellectual debates happening around commons in other parts of the world, we thought is very important to rediscover collectiveness in Southeast Europe, especially after the breakdown of the self-governing, self-management socialism in Yugoslavia, and the neoliberal, the kind of capitalist neoliberal transition which followed in the next few decades, where everything which was collective was vilified, where we lost any kind of social capital even, or the capacity to cooperate, because everything which related to collective and cooperation is supposed to be archaic and failed, something that we tried in Yugoslavia and we miserably failed, and something which is not modern even, something which is even pre-modern. And to commons, being a part of important debates on intellectual level and activist level, we thought that this is also something which we can bring back to Southeast Europe, connected with our ongoing tradition of commoning in Southeast Europe, and then try to kind of reignite this kind of thinking, research, and action. This is also, in our mind, the concept which unites different progressive struggles and practices on climate justice, on free internet, on open source technology, commodification of nature, the welfare state, reform of the welfare state services, which are patriarchal and very patronizing still, etc. But then again, the neoliberals are destroying the welfare state as such. So we are, we want public services and welfare state to change. But yet again, the neoliberals are just trying to cancel and destroy the welfare state as it is, to avoid any kind of redistribution of resources. And then also we thought that this is also, this kind of concept is important for radical democratization and radical, recontextualization of society, and even of this kind of market sphere, which is the way, because it's then linked to different practices of economic democracy, but also to even reforming the state or reimagining the state or changing the state through kind of localization, through kind of re-democratization, and really discussing what is the fair access to the resource, what is the collective control, how people are supposed to practice this collective control, and how we can sustainably use these resources. So the commons is also kind of a concept which we think is important to democratize both the economic and political sphere, even though, as we know, those two are interconnected. In terms of just a brief context, I'll have to go really fast through all this. In terms of historical context of Southeast Europe related to commons, there are different practices throughout history, and we looked at Southeast Europe as former Yugoslavia, so not only these three countries that we researched the practices, but also Serbia and Montenegro and Slovenia and Kosovo. And we tried to kind of look at different practices of commoning in history, and we found that they're pretty much related to different feudal systems which existed in this region, where a part with Slovenia and Croatia mostly was a part of the feudal system which was developed in Habsburg Empire and the institutions which were developed there, and the other part is developed within the different system of Ottoman feudal system. And then there are also different kind of practices which are interesting, like Gmajna, which is a common pasture practice in Croatia and Slovenia. And then also the concept of vakuf, which was used pretty much within the Ottoman societies, which were actually some kind of endowments, some kind of gifts in land, buildings, to be used freely by all people of society. And then this kind of, so this is more related to this kind of a res communis concept, where something which is then a gift to society is accessible to all, and this is strictly regulated, that it has to be accessible to all members of society. And then also the concept of zadruga, which would translate to English as cooperative, and this is something which, a term which was used also, is used now. I mean, it was used also in socialist Yugoslavia, but actually it's a term which derives, it's a term which comes from a very specific type of economic unit, which was called that way from the Middle Ages, and it appeared in Southeast Europe only. So this was a concept which is a part of anthropological and ethnological world literature. So I think this is one of the maybe the only concept in anthropological world literature which comes from Balkan language as zadruga. And this was really researched a lot in the 20th and 19th century. And there was this kind of family cooperative, kind of extended economic units which were not just which were based on kinship, but they had all these kind of commoning institutions developed, and then this went on all over from the Middle Ages even to the 20th century in some of the areas of Southeast Europe. But of course, I mean, the most important practice and the most important experience comes from the socialist Yugoslavia, and many experiments which were happening within the socialist Yugoslavia, and these experiments were happening on the property level, on the political level, and they also happened on the governance level. And this is just a show of different constitutional changes of how Yugoslavia was experimenting with social property as a different type of property comparing to the state property and private property, and how it also experimented with self-governance, how it experimented with self-governance in different productive and non-productive sectors of society. So in how it experimented with this in care, how it experimented with that in industrial factories, etc. And a lot of this, unfortunately, practices and research is something which was vilified after the 90s. So we had to rediscover this. We had to research again of these experiences because these were important experiments, and even people like Branko Horvat, who was an economist from Yugoslavia, he was one of the candidates for the Nobel Award in economics. He worked with Eleanor Ostrom a lot during this year. She visited Yugoslavia, also studying self-governance for many times, as it was also, I mean, visited by even Milton Friedman and people like that. But I mean, this was something which was studied. This was something which was lectured in Harvard University and universities around the world, and yet, you know, it was completely vilified and disappeared after the 1990. So there's not enough research. There's not enough records. The witnesses, you know, are pretty old. So we don't have much time also to, you know, talk with them in practice how this worked, because there were different self-governance practices in different factories, in different hospitals, in different kindergartens, in different housing units, and you know, some worked, some didn't work, and it would be really a pity and shame that all this experimentation, which was happening on state scale, and of course we're not saying that this was perfect, and we're not saying that this was very democratic, especially in terms of, I mean, electoral politics. As you know, there was no kind of multi-party system in Yugoslavia in place, but still there were a lot of kind of self-governance and this kind of democratization experiments going on, and it would be a pity not to evaluate this and learn from this. And this is, of course, something which is very much influencing these institutions which are still embedded in our society, even though, or part of these institutions, even though we went through this neoliberal transition, are very much influencing the prospect of commons in the future. And it's important to study those and kind of bear that in mind. I mean, that we are not tabula rasa, which is just downloading Western concepts like commons, but that we have some experience and institutions, and we try to see how these Western concepts of commons fit to our reality, to our context, and to our needs. We actually identified some of these governance practices. I would say we described them and maybe slightly analyzed them. So we analyzed 4 governance practices. One was this pasturing community in Croatia, and I don't know if Iris is here. Hopefully not, because she's from this community. And she heard it on Green Academy many times, and finally we did this research. Because we were quite late with this whole project. And she can tell you much more about it, I mean, in the breaks, etc. But basically we were looking at how looking at commons governance practices on this example, for example, what was this history of the institutions which govern the access and control over these resources. And, you know, for example, Ekogaina survived 5 different states through history. So 5 different states through history appeared and disappeared, and they were still continuing their practice, which, you know, quite remarkable. And then, you know, we were also analyzing the resource. In case of Ekogaina, it's a grassland, it's a pasture. That's why we wanted to also describe it, because it's kind of archetypical commons. And of course, today commons are many things and many practices, but archetypical commons are always this kind of pastures, etc. It's 370 hectares near river of Sava. It has a huge biodiversity of 250 plant species, and the community which is governing these commons are basically 17 family farms, OPGs, obiteljska poljoprivredna gospodarstva, and they are all from 2 villages. So they define their community that only family farms from 3 villages surrounding this land can have access to this land for pasture. So it's not open access, it's restricted access. And they said everybody can become a member, but you have to be, you know, from 3 villages surrounding it. And then, you know, this is a debate then, you know, is this fair or not, you know? You know, I would say probably it wouldn't be fair that anybody can access this pasture, you know, and corporations from Zagreb, etc. And then, you know, if you restrict it, then you have to define how you restrict it, and is it fair or not. So this is also something which is debated for every commons, using these normative criteria. There were institutions which were developed over 150 years. These were basically rules, you know, on pasturing, putting stock, you know, changing how the Sava floods the pasture. Then they had to change, you know, where they put the pasture, etc. Always somebody had to be the cattleman or cattlewoman, somebody was always have to take care of the stock, and then they were rotating. They had a special system how to rotate and how to distribute the workload, the labor on this. They have special kind of institutions for deciding if they would expand or not, or changing the rules. But also in the late, because of the late Croatia institutional context, they had to establish a cooperative. So they had to legalize their informal rules and institutions, because otherwise they could not get any subsidies from the state, and they could not have a rent contract, because this state is basically owned by the, this land is basically owned by the state. So, and the state said, like, okay, you want to rent the land from us? You know, you just divide the land and we give you, you know, 17 different rent contracts. And I said, no, 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 but we want together to rent the land. I said, but why? I mean, it doesn't make sense. You know, why just you don't divide, you know, and, you know, that's it. And they said, but look, I mean, the river floods the pasture. So sometimes, you know, this part is flooded, sometimes it's the other. It doesn't make sense to divide the land. We want to do it this way. We are doing this way for 150 years. And then they were struggling. And they were the only practice so far that we found, and they also know about, which is doing the pasturing in this way. There were many practices like that before, but now only them survived. And they were trying to change the law to recognize them as such practice. But they are the only example. And they were struggling for 7, 8 years to do it. And finally they managed to somehow, to partly do it. But they had to establish a cooperative. So they established a legal cooperative. Now they have legal and formal institutions. And yeah, in terms of the gender perspective, out of 17 representatives in this cooperative, there's only one woman which is present, which is representative of her family farm and making decisions. And of course, I mean, there are many more women, I mean, working within these farms, but they are not representing the board. And then also, there are many problems, and as I said, one of them is institutional framework, but also they are doing an ecosystem service, because this is a very high biodiversity area, and they are putting endangered species of cattle to this pasture, and they are protecting the biodiversity also by pasturing, because then this kind of plant, which is invasive species, would distribute, which would then decrease the retention capacity of this huge pasture when the river floods. So basically they are improving biodiversity, but they are also protecting the city, which is downstream, from the floods. But even though they are doing this, nobody is paying for that. So I mean, this is externality that they do, and this is not regulated. So basically they are struggling to have this endangered species of animal pasturing there, even though now it's not anymore economically viable, also because of macroeconomic structural drivers of agriculture in Croatia, etc., the import, the monetary policy of Croatia, etc., which influence that this is not economic anymore. But they are doing all these ecosystem services which are not recognized or not kind of granted by society. And also what they are struggling with is also cooperative legacy, because cooperative unfortunately was used in the beginning of Yugoslavia until, let's say, 1950 for forced cooperatives in the countryside. People were forced to join agricultural cooperatives, and they have very bad memories from that. And now even the word cooperative is creating problems, and nobody wants to join cooperative in the rural areas, because, you know, it's called cooperative, which reminds them on this kind of forced collectivization, which is similar to kind of Soviet style, but only for the first, let's say, 4 or 5 years of socialist Yugoslavia. So I'm finishing now. So some preliminary conclusions from all these cases, and I didn't even talk about the struggles, but you have all that in the book and online, show that all this governance, commons governance, are existing, but they are really difficult to identify because they are not so visible, and you really have to research deeply to find such practices. And people who are doing it, of course, don't call it commons. For them, it's a kind of common sense, because they are doing it sometimes for hundreds of years, or they are doing it for the last 10 years. But they don't necessarily know about any kind of commons theory, movement, paradigm, etc. This is not the case for common struggles, because they are more visible in public, in media, etc. And the research shows that a lot of these struggles actually use the discourse of the commons when, speaking publicly about against privatization, commodification, or some kind of state enclosure. As we also found that for all the governance cases, there's a very difficult legal framework, and it's really endangering the sustainability of these examples. One example of that is in Bosnia, where in one village they are managing their own water distribution system. So they built their own water distribution system, and they are maintaining it. They are collecting money on, just from villagers to maintain it. They are taking samples of water, going to laboratory. So they are doing it alone, without any kind of government, with any kind of market. They just do it cooperatively. And now the government is introducing standards that this is not healthy, it's not safe to drink that kind of water, it has to be regulated, it has to be controlled by the state, and they are forcing them to join the water distribution system of the nearby city. So, and this is also linked to the European Union legislation on the water safety, and and which is then endangering, this kind of legislative framework is endangering this kind of practices. And also what we found out that on all the commoning practices, there are always some kind of support structure within the community. There are no cases where all the commoners contribute and govern the commons in the same way, but always there's a cooperative or there's a small organization which is within the community which takes care of the biggest burden of the governance and contributed to the commons. So always there is some kind of, let's say, more active group within the community, without which this would collapse. And also what is really important is that there are no pure commons, and this is also shown in these examples, which are outside of the market and which are outside of the state. The commons are practices which are embedded with the state-market relations. They are not isolated in space. And we actually saw different forms of commons and different kind of hybrid forms of civil-public partnerships by the community and the local government, or even some kind of concessions where the government grants certain governance rights to some communities, some kind of non-profit concessions instead of private concessions, some kind of civic-public partnerships instead of public-private partnerships, which are for-profit, etc. So we see different forms of kind of how these commons practices are embedded within the state and within the market. So I'll finish here. Thanks. So we have, I would say, up to 10 minutes for Q&A session, for questions and answers, also comments. I mean, and something which was definitely not said because many perspectives were, of course, not informed. So maybe if somebody wants to add something or ask a question, feel free to do it.
I just want to have one comment, because when you said that they enforced this eco-community in Croatia, what was the name, sorry? When they've been forced into individual ownership, it reminds me of the story of Zona Defender, the autonomous community in close to Nantes, that Macron now destroyed with 2,500 intervened policemen. So like what they've been asked from the state is to go individually as a project over the state in order to let them stay in this community which they've been occupying since the 60s. They've been growing tomatoes, potatoes and other things there, in case you don't know. So since Macron nobody touched them in such a violent way, but like they refused because they said we want to go forward as a collective being toward the state, and then he sent the police, and now they're no longer there. Yeah. So that's interesting. This the same state approach, like toward in a different way.
Yeah. As we said, I mean, this is also just one proof that there are no commons outside of the state. I mean, all the commons practices, one way or another, happen within the authority and jurisdiction and territories of the state. I mean, there are some exceptions from that, but most of them are. And we don't look at commons as a kind of different sphere, but something as a concept which can, ask good questions about democratizing society, but also from the perspective of the state. So instead of, when we talk about public services, question. Maybe Paul wants to talk about this a bit. You raise your hand.
I don't ask you about public service.
Okay.
So you proceed.
Okay. So for example, so first of all, I mean those normative criteria that we spoke, like fair access and ecological sustainability, or sustainability can be one against the other, like with the water. So then you say, okay, like, is it open access or it's not? If it's fair access, who has how much? And then maybe here the example, and also there are examples of water, drinking water and sanitation being distributed by communities, like in Bosnia in this case. There are also examples of them being distributed by the public companies, and they are water distribution services which are distributed by the private companies, right? And then there's, you will see today the movie on the water privatization. You will get much more kind of this issue, and this will be also important because probably on the last day we'll do a workshop, and water will be one of the issues. So please come to the movie tonight to get the context about it. But we say, for example, that it's a false dilemma to either have corporations to run water services and treat water as commodity on which they make profit, and it's usually a monopoly on which they make profit, and in the same time have public water companies which are often corrupt, which are often also inefficient, which are using water unsustainably, and that's the problem. But then we say, trying to use the commons as a paradigm, why we don't democratize public services, why don't we democratize public companies, and there where communities themselves are managing to provide water services and they're happy with it, then leave it like that. I mean, why everything has to be connected to the state system? It doesn't have to be. So, if these communities are self-managing and they are doing fine and they don't want, to be connected to the city system, in Croatia there's 80,000 people who get water like that. I mean, you would be amazed. I mean, nobody knows about it, but there's 80,000 people who get water in this way. And so we think that, that commons are also is a concept to ask right questions on changing the local governance, changing even the state as how we conceptualize it, and democratizing and asking the question about what is fair access to water, what is collective control over the water, and what is sustainable use of the water. So, Anna. So you had another.
I wanted to make a point and ask you your opinion. I was involved with the European Commons Assembly in the European Parliament, and I felt that the elephant in the room was the state. And there is a rejection to talk about the state. And if you don't talk about it, it might go away, and then you might believe in Father Christmas. And I think it's important that there is an opening on a debate of what do we do with the state, what type of state, and because you're going to have to interact. So I'm happy that you're mentioning this. That you're embedded in a system that you need to react. And if the system is friendlier, it's easier to do stuff. It seems to me pretty obvious. So I would invite also to look at these experiences in issues such as, for instance, public health. It's becoming very fashionable saying public health is a common. But how do you see public services here? How do you see the universality of some elements in society? Because there is a very dangerous element I find, talking among convinced, is that some community that is well off can detach from society in a much easier way than a poor working class community. So unless we do not have a universalist view, maybe French revolutionary, but for setting up a minimum standard at society level, not state, but society, we're gonna basically put communities one against the other, and usually in this fight, which win. So the role of public services has been to level this up. So it's not been existent. You can make some comment on how do you see. Like especially on health,
sure.
If you can look at that.
I could answer now in length, but I don't want to because Debbie will talk about the municipalism and the state and how to probably, and also change it or get away without it. And and I have many thoughts on this. I believe that there's some kind of coordination mechanism between communities, and redistribution mechanism should exist. And that's already some kind of supra-community regime. And somebody will call it state, some will call it differently, but probably something is needed to avoid these kind of problems. But this is really a fierce debate that's going on. I mean, so I don't want to start it now because it will take too much time. And Anna, you raise your hand, and I also want to just raise the question of, I talked about the classical productive goods-related, economy-related side of the commons, and Anna already presented her session, which will be on Wednesday, I guess, or on the power in unity, right? Social reproduction. Okay. I mean, what's the name? The name of the? Yeah. Social reproduction. Okay. Yeah. So about the whole reproductive side of the commons, which, as Anna said, often doesn't get is not a part of the picture. I mean, and it's fundamental also.
No, but I was wanted to raise something similar to what Tom said, because when we were talking about the comments on the Observatorio Metropolitano, we always started this story with the key elements of the community, the resources, and the way of governance of the institutions, but also as these four characteristics of universality, democracy, sustainability, and inalienability. And I think that there is something interesting when you introduce, because this issue of the universality, I mean, when you talk about open access or not open access, and in relation with the commons in the state, I think that there we should go a little bit more in depth, because of course we have this idea of the universality, of the French Revolution, but that was the universality of male owners. So any state-based universality, it is a restricted community of some sort. And this actually I think we have also to recognize. So to give this capacity to the state to recognize wider communities is group, but I think that taking for granted that this is universal, it's quite a bit tricky. But for me this is interesting because it will link this idea. So what is the link between the commons and the municipality? The municipalism, and it's precisely to me what are these key factors of how the state actually is implementing a certain kind of governance in the territory that is factually stated on certain criteria, and then on some values that we all recognize, like universality, but then it acts in a constant segmentation, for example, and then an equal recognition of the different segments of the society. So, yeah. So for me, the question is not so much like what is the kind of access, which is interesting. I think that this should be thought more in depth of how do you make this mechanism of access. But then, parallel to that is what are we going to do with this idea of universality? And this then to me will work with these ideas of federation, but also replicability, and how you make conditions for replicability, also in our own practices, in order to proliferate our case or be able to scale up these practices. And then another thing that it crossed my mind, what you said about the Wikipedia, but also about the supporting structures. I don't know if you have been looking at what is this relation, because hackers, they have this 1990 system where what they say is that out of 100 whatever units, there is only 1% that is very, very active producing the code, 10% that are actually reporting the bugs and are a little bit aware of the discussions of the core members, but not so much, but they can replace the core members. And then there is 90% of people like in Wikipedia that just use it. And that's fine.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a good ecology. And I'm interested, and I'm been working about, we could also maybe discuss about what is this scale, for example, in the municipalist movement in Spain, and what are these powers of 10 in organizations, and it could be very interesting to know what is this That there was an article recently saying that the threshold of the minority is 10% as well to actually produce changes in rights.
There were many hands before. I would rather, if we can maybe do the break now and continue the discussion later, because we will link comments with municipalism, so we will continue. But yeah, I mean, and then I will maybe comment also on these questions, because there are also hierarchies which we show, which we see. We also see hierarchies within communities. I mean, so there is no some kind of complete, hierarchy within communities of commons, but there are always some delegates and some who, decide most and who work most. And this is, something which in practice always appears. But okay. So let's start in 12:45. So we have 12 minutes. Sorry for that, but then you're finished in 2:15.